Welcome. Wow, it's so great to see so many people interested and engaging in the story of Denmark Vesey and what his legacy means to our community. Thank you all for coming. I'm Lissa Frankel. I'm president and CEO of the Charleston Gilead Center, and I am very proud to be partnering with the Mother Emanuel AME Church and the International African American Museum to bring you 3 days of cultural performances, conversations like tonight, popular music, classical music, and comedy, in order to engage with this important historic figure for our community and hopefully open people's minds and start conversation. 200 years ago, Denmark Vesey planned arguably the most sophisticated uprising to free the enslaved people of Charleston in our country before the Civil War. He was fighting to free our community members. Of all the communities in this nation, ours can and should speak with united pride about his legacy, and we're excited to do that tonight. It is our hope that this discussion about Vesey and other important Black leaders spurs continued conversation. And with that intent in mind, we are filming the panel discussion tonight, and we'll be releasing it as part of our Raising the Volume series, a series of discussions on music, race, art, activism, and community. The film will then be made available to our schools, both public and private, all throughout the Low Country. And it will be accompanied by a curriculum guide where teachers can engage with the topic of Denmark Vesey and use this panel as a discussion point with their kids. We are Charleston's Cultural Center for our students, and we're also your cultural center. And we are firm in our commitment to you that will provide a platform through the arts for discussion and exploration. We hope you will continue to engage with us as we go on this journey together as a community. And we're just delighted, I'm delighted to start the panel tonight. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you the man who introduced me to Denmark Vesey and who encouraged us to find a significant way to recognize this bicentenary. The historian from the Mother Emanuel Church, our moderator tonight, and my friend, Lee Bennett. That is a little bit.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And on behalf of the Gilead Center, in partnership with Mother Emanuel AME Church and the soon-to-open International African American Museum, we welcome you to the kickoff event of 3 days of cultural conversations, performances, all commemorating the bicentenary of the uprising of 1822 to free the enslaved people of Charleston, South Carolina. Tonight's panel discussion, entitled Truth Be Told, will take a new look at this historical figure. We'll have discussions to dispel and address some of the misrepresentation of Denmark Vesey and shed light on his role as a liberator and freedom fighter. It is our hope, it is our prayers that through these discussions that we will contribute to the community a better understanding of the brutal truths and the repercussions of slavery. Truth be told, Denmark Vesey led the planned slave insurrection of 1822. But as a result of the plan being disclosed, someone told, 131 people are arrested, many of them members of the African church. 93 would go to trial. 38 would be released for lack of evidence. 26 would be acquitted. But 11 of the 26 that are acquitted were deemed so dangerous by this tribunal that they were sent into permanent exile out of the United States. And 35 would be executed. They were hung. Denmark Vesey and 5 others were executed on July the 2nd of 1822, somewhere between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. in the morning. And then 22 black men were all executed at the same time, same place, on July the 26th of 1822. Newspaper articles said they were placed in wagons and made to sit on top of their coffins and paraded around the city and taken to the gallows. The gallows were poorly prepared. There was no crowd controls, and they did not work properly. As a result, many of them were shot in the back of the head. When it was all said and done, 35 were executed. Some of the citizens of the city decided to destroy the church. Laws that were already on the books were vigorously enforced. Laws like the Negro Seamen's Act of 1822, which essentially said if you were a free black sailor and you came into port here in Charleston, you were removed from your ship and then placed in the city jail, and you had to wait in the city jail until your ship left port. This was called the Negro Seamen's Act of 1822. And then from 1834 until 1865, through South Carolina state legislation, the African churches were shut down. And in 1865, the Civil War ended. And the church was reestablished. And this is the first time that the name Emmanuel is being used. God be with us. Truth be told, I would never have imagined that a young boy that grew up in the borough here in downtown Charleston, a block away from Gadsden's Wharf, a block away from Emmanuel AME Church, whose address was 34 Alexander Street, the same address almost shared by the Gilliard Center, would be standing on this stage this evening. My name is Lee Bennett, Jr., and I will be your moderator for tonight's panel discussion. Tonight's panel includes Mark Bemuthi Joseph, Vice President and Artistic Director of Social Impact at the Kennedy Center, librettist and poet. Charlemagne the God, media mogul and TV and radio personality. Dr. Tanya M. Matthews, President and CEO of the International African American Museum. W. Kamal Bell, comedian, director, and executive producer. Dr. Tamara Butler, Executive Director of the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture. And Dr. Bernard Powers, Professor Emeritus of History at the College of Charleston and founding director for the Center for the Study of Slavery in Charleston, and board member IAAM. Before we get started with our discussion, I would like to ask Dr. Powers to help us set the conditions and give some highlights about Denmark Vesey. Some of you may have heard a lot of this, but many of you in the audience may be hearing some of this discussion for the first time. Dr. Powers.
Thank you so very much. And I'm so happy to be here at this event, which really represents the continuation of some events that started a few weeks earlier and will continue throughout this weekend, and collectively they represent the most significant public events surrounding Denmark Vesey in Charleston since the erection of the monument in 2014. So this is a tremendous milestone for the city of Charleston and South Carolina. So good evening, and let me urge you to take a look at the program, which has a note which contains information on Denmark Vesey's tragic and consequential life, because my remarks will stem from that material. Now, to study Denmark Vesey is to examine the dynamic interplay of slavery and freedom, liberty and oppression. Now, think of what he had experienced prior to 1822. Arriving in Charleston in 1783, he probably still heard some of the reverberations of the rhetoric of the American Revolution, wherein patriot leaders condemned George III for abusing their rights and attempting to reduce them to what they called slavery. But how hollow those words must have sounded to Denmark Vesey. Here in Charleston, he passed into freedom, and he learned the details of the Haitian Revolution and interacted with refugees, both enslaved and free from that place. He saw the tremendous cost and sacrifice required for black folk to pursue freedom. Then, beginning in 1820, Jean-Pierre Boyer, the Haitian president, began inviting African Americans to immigrate to this new land that abolition had created and to enjoy the full measure of their humanity. And almost simultaneously, in 1818, Vesey witnessed black religious liberation in Charleston. The African church was created and then affiliated with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first independent black religious denomination in America. One cannot overestimate the revolutionary significance of these events, because the AME Church was unapologetically abolitionist and anti-racist. Vesey joined the church and its struggle for survival as leaders and members were arrested, fined, and whipped. This attack on black spirituality and the desecration of the African church was a most bitter pill and a catalyst for rebellion. While Denmark Vesey's planned insurrection never matured, many believed its organization to have been among the most complex ever conceived. Discovery of the plot and the fact that those involved were relatively privileged slaves and that Vesey was free profoundly shaped South Carolina's subsequent history. The question became, if these men could not be trusted, then how dangerous were those less indulged and more harshly treated? During the Haitian Revolution, many French refugees fled to Charleston along with their slaves. They also brought hair-raising stories of the bloodletting which accompanied that revolution. Those memories were widely shared in this state and persisted throughout the antebellum period. They also helped to amplify white fears unleashed by the discovery of Vesey's plans. White Carolinians understood how tightly they had to control their society lest disaster result. With the rise of militant abolition, symbolized by John Brown and his effort to raise a slave rebellion in Virginia, South Carolina leaders believed their future held few good options. With the election of Abraham Lincoln, a man branded an abolitionist in the South, secession began here in South Carolina, the state with the highest rate of slaveholding in the entire region. Yes, secession was about protecting slavery, but equally about saving white lives, then jeopardized in a country about to be led by a quote-unquote abolitionist president. And the war came. The irony is that hundreds of thousands of Southern white men died in a failed attempt to preserve white lives based on black oppression. After the Emancipation Proclamation, abolitionist Frederick Douglass recruited soldiers for the Union Army and called men of color to arms. And in doing so, he urged them to remember Denmark Vesey. And black men answered, and despite fearsome odds and myriad discouragements, pledged their lives to Vesey's unfinished business, and ironically saved the nation that Vesey had made every effort to flee.
A little about our format tonight. We will have a panel discussion followed by a question and answer period. Hopefully many of you have already received information about submitting your questions, and we'll collect your questions throughout and get prepared for the question and answer period. Let's get started. Denmark Vesey has been discussed and written about in various ways. As a liberator, freedom fighter, a violent, brutish villain, terrorist, a man merely a product of his times, and even just someone wrongly accused. He has been memorialized so differently by so many people. So my question, how do each of you see Denmark Vesey? What is the narrative you would embrace?
I think Queens first.
Oh, well, thank you, Brother Charlemagne. So, when I think of the story of Denmark Vesey, I kind of relate to my own story. I am the product of a wonderful mother and father, and I grew up in that home, second generation striving. And I remember paying attention to some of the things, going on in the world and wondering, well, I have a home and I'm going to school and I'm going to college. Am I allowed to be in the revolution? I didn't know, right? It was, I have all of this stuff, right? Should I step out of line? And that is when I first discovered the autobiography of Angela Davis, who had a very similar background. And the more and more I learned about the story of Denmark Vesey, I had heard the outlines of it, but I heard about what was done. I didn't hear about who the man was. So when I heard and realized that he was a man who had freed himself, had tried to free his family and was denied. So now we've got a free man, we've got a husband, we've got a father, we've got a small business owner, we've got a founding deacon of one of the most legendary congregations in the African American canon. And this man is looking around at all that he has and deciding that it isn't enough, not because he wants more, because his privilege has shown him that more is required for everyone else. And I think that is the thing that resonates with me most, particularly in the time we are in now, where we're watching the unusual suspects on the front lines. Like, what are you doing? You have a pension. Why are you protesting? And so I think that understanding that story and that history, so that's really what resonated with me when I discovered who he was, as a man, and all that he was putting on the table was the same thing that had motivated him to take these steps in the first place.
I'll jump in, sure. So I'll probably say that for me, Denmark Vesey represents a dreamer. Because I just believe that you can be a fighter, there's a lot of things you can do, but you can't do it unless you've had a dream or a vision of possibilities. So to even think that you can rally around and you manage to find other dreamers who would say, this is not the life that we were destined to live, and that there is a world beyond this one, is really amazing to me. And I think so often we think about his desire for liberation and freedom and all of that, but I think it all starts with being able to dream a better and bigger life. And so for me, I just see him as the kind of person who carries possibility, and it's also amazing to me that people dreamers recognize other dreamers. So the fact that all of these men put their lives on the line and was like, we trust him, we trust this person, and he, if nothing else, we're all gonna go to freedom, and if we can't, then we'll figure it out. But so I think that's also important for me. So as I learned about him, because as I said in an earlier interview, Vesey wasn't covered in school, so I don't remember ever hearing his name. Any of y'all out there who went to Mount Zion or School of the Arts, if y'all recall that, please correct me. But I was like, I don't remember him until I got to grad school, and I was under the tutelage of several Atlantic World scholars. And it was at that moment that it allowed me to think about home. So I'm from Johns Island, and to think about resistance being, that's right, woo-woo, to think about resistance being so close, and just thinking about the fact that, these kinds of areas, the Charleston area, the Sea Islands, people talk about indigo and slavery and rice, but never do people really get a chance to talk about resistance. And so I think that's important. Our ancestors were not all complacent, and we had dreams. And so I wanted to highlight that I believe that he and all of his co-conspirators had to be dreamers.
Word. For me, Brother Denmark quite simply, represented a man who didn't forget where he came from. And when I first heard that story when I was younger, long before I was, in any of the positions that I'm in now, when I was just growing up in Moncks Corner, South Carolina, I always thought to myself that, when I get in a position of privilege, or in a position where, I'm doing well financially, I'm never going to forget, the people that are still, in his time was still in bondage. And, it bugs me out when I hear people call Denmark a terrorist, because I'm like, well, if he's a terrorist, who were the people that were oppressing him? What do you call the people that were enslaving, all of those black people in Charleston, South Carolina, if he was the terrorist? So for me, he just simply represented, a brother who didn't forget where he came from.
I just want to say, first of all, I'm happy to be back in South Carolina. I had not come here until I did the United States of America episode here in Charleston. Thank you. Even though I never felt like I'd been here before, then I had my DNA tested, and apparently I'm from here too, so hello, family. What's up, cousins?
Everybody is, really.
Yeah. So I'm glad to be back home, is what I'm trying to say. Thank you. So for me, Denmark's Vesey story is about what happens as a black person once you get to the side of black privilege, to quote Charlemagne's book. Like, once you get through the door and you have some freedom and you have some largesse and you have some happiness, what do you do once you get through that door? Because once you get through that door, many of the people who are through that door on the other side, white people, will encourage you to close the door behind you. And so for me, it's about, and this is a challenge I put before myself every day, now that I'm through one door on that side, how can I keep the door open and pull other people who aren't on this side of the door through? And so for me, the story of Denmark Vesey is like, you don't forget where you came from, and you don't settle and get relaxed.
Peace, everyone. I'm a native New Yorker. I'm a father. I am an artist. I'm a first-generation American. My people are from the same place that Denmark Vesey is from, an island that was called Saint-Domingue, which we call Haiti. The revolution that inspired Denmark Vesey is the revolution that courses through my blood and through my bones. I live in Washington, D.C. now, and it's a very strange place. It's a very strange place. I specifically work at the Kennedy Center, which is a living memorial dedicated to the 35th president. His words are everywhere. And American promise, as etched in marble, is a strange environment to work in and work within. When I think of Denmark Vesey, I actually think about Detroit. Motown for sure, but also this young man named Jamaria Hall, who with a group of other young people from Detroit's worst performing high schools sued the state of Michigan a few years back, 2018, because the schools were underperforming at this particular level. This group of young people sued because it was a class action lawsuit because they believed that their rights, their constitutional rights, were being violated under the 14th Amendment. It's instructive. To be a part of the franchise means you have to have words. That we have a right to literacy as part of the American franchise. This was the premise of the lawsuit. And so, like, what else? Do you have the right to clean air? Do you have the right to water? Do you have the right to joy, to inspiration? What actually constitutes Americanness? And I'm so glad that Dr. T brought up this idea that a family man was disassociated from his family, and so he was not free because his wife was not, because his children were not. And part of what constitutes that freedom, that sovereignty for this particular individual was access to letters. And that 200-year sweep from this person who was murdered because he had a plan, he was creating an infrastructure for hope and freedom, to these kids in Detroit who have a plan and vision for themselves as Americans with access to letters. That's the legacy. And when I think about this individual, when I think about this ancestor, I think about the legacy of letters. That we come from a people, look at us on stage. We come from a people, our people were not allowed to read. Look at the programs you're holding. Contraband. All of y'all. And so a person that could hack that, could cut through that, to make a way for us through letters. That's what I believe the legacy is.
Careful now, Bermuda. You know they always kill the poets first.
It's true. It's true.
Let me just pick up on that, what Bamuthi pointed out about the Kennedy Center, which brings to mind what President Kennedy would say. And that was, those who make peaceful change impossible make violent revolution inevitable.
Right.
President John Fitzgerald Kennedy said that. So he would understand the position that Vesey was in. He would understand it, and he would understand that the choices that Vesey had before him were limited. He couldn't vote his way into freedom. He couldn't sit in his way into freedom. He couldn't petition his way to freedom. And in fact, this was the same situation that the American patriotic generation found themselves in. And so what did they do? They took up arms. And Vesey and people like Vesey and less well off, most enslaved people were less well off, were far more oppressed than Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, George Washington, but they took up arms, didn't they? Mm-hmm. They took up arms. So how can we, other than characterize him as a legitimate liberator, freedom fighter.
Amen. Well, a follow-on to that, why were there so many narratives? And how do we go about honoring figures like Vesey? We had many narratives. Why so many?
Because white people be lying.
Next question.
Okay. Any follow-on to that?
Well, to build and nuance, yeah, but because one, and I'm becoming a bit of a broken record on this, but one of my favorite African proverbs is, hunters will be heroes until lions become historians. And so we're talking about a very classic situation in who is writing the narrative, right? This is when we talk about the way, say, a Frederick Douglass talked about Denmark Vesey, he talked about him very differently. He talked about him as a fellow early abolitionist, right? And so, we have this period in which the reason you want to deny these black people letters is so that they cannot write their own story, so that there is not a counter narrative. But truth be told, black folks still know how to carry a story.
See what she did there?
Right. I'm trying to get it in there. And so I think one of the reasons there are so many narratives is about who is telling the story, and let's just be a little bit real. Everyone who tells a story has an agenda behind that story. So if you want to know why there's a different narrative, you have to interrogate the agenda of whoever is telling you the story. And there are those for whom it was advantageous to consider this man a terrorist, a brute, so that he would not be associated with the quintessentially American founding principle of freedom. You couldn't have this man embody that more so than those who were keeping him in that space.
Well, that vein, right in there, we're going to continue with that because a lot was written about Denmark Vesey during, well after the Civil War. Men like Frederick Douglass, as Dr. Powers said, and others wrote about Denmark Vesey in very, very positive ways, as a revolutionary, as a liberator, as a freedom fighter. So when exactly did it change? And why do you think the narrative changed so much from positive to negative? And I won't start with you, Charlamagne. I'll start on this side. Why did it change?
I honestly don't know why it changed, but it's always so interesting to me because when people say that about him, I'm like, well, what did y'all think slavery was? Clearly you had to agree with slavery if you didn't think he was anything less than a liberator, anything less than a freedom fighter. So when the story was first told to me, it was always told from the perspective of this man was just simply trying to liberate his people. This man, won the lottery, bought his freedom, couldn't afford to get his wife and his child, but in his mind, even when he opened up a successful carpentry shop, in his mind, he just knew nobody's free until everybody's free. So it's just like, I never even knew the narrative changed until recently. I never looked at him as anything other than a liberator and freedom fighter, and nobody can tell me different. And if you do tell me different, then you are part of the problem.
One of the great things about my show is I get to travel around to places like this and talk to people who are on the ground, regular folks who are not sort of caught up in whatever the main story is. I just talk to them on the street. And the episode we have coming up this weekend is about black folks in Appalachia. And one of them are here. There's more than that. But we went to Harper's Ferry, and there's a tribute to John Brown there. And there was a white couple walking around, and they'd say, "Oh, that's the guy from television." And they were talking to me, and they were walking around this tribute to John Brown saying, but I hear he also, was he a villain? I hear in John Brown's home, in his where there's a tribute, still confused about whether or not John Brown was on the right side or not. And a lot of the ways in which history does that is through the use of violence. If you are a person who is if you're a black person advocating for black people or a white ally advocating for black people and using violence, then maybe you're not as good as we thought you were. Because why should anybody get hurt? And so I feel like a lot of times the way in which we think, and this has happened with Martin Luther King Jr., we have a history a lot of have shaved off the rough edges for the part about hugs. When if you look at Martin Luther King, the totality of his speeches, a lot of people's favorite quote is the "I have a dream" speech. Mine is "A riot is the language of the unheard." And I think a lot of times history shaves off, the people who write, the winners who write the history shave off the rough edges because they want to believe that the liberation of anybody can be done through hugs and handshakes, not through violent revolution in the streets.
I'm just going to jump in and make a shameless plug. I don't know if y'all read the paper since we're on this King topic, but Avery recently acquired the recording of MLK's speech here in Charleston. So, to build on that, just to think about, I can't wait for you all to hear it because it's exactly that. They've shaved off the rough edges, and when you sit down and dig into what King is talking about, it's like, oh, maybe I need to go back and reconsider really who he was advocating for and what he was advocating for, because he gets pretty real, and he's not about hugs and handshakes in that particular recording. But that was my spiel. That's it.
So what can we do better or differently regarding how we discuss history to improve the civility and better understanding among all people? What can we do?
History is not a comic book. It's not humans and humanity. We are complex beings, and I would like to think that we are intelligent enough collectively to be able to absorb, handle, metabolize, and apply nuance as it relates to narratives in general. I think the kind of binary, heroes and villains way of telling a story on television isn't the way that we should be telling our common history. It's just not as simple. So if you want to ask, or if you ask, what can we do better? I think one of the things that we can do better is apply faith or use faith in one another's intelligence to be able to disseminate complex narratives or to delineate complex narratives. I almost always learned as a child this kind of binary way of thinking about all humans. And maybe that was for my safety. But when I think about Mitch McConnell, who is a father, and I think about myself, who is a father, and I think about our kids, I wonder where along the arc was the narrative positioned in such a way that my child's freedom became an incursion upon his children's freedom? How does that happen? How do we remove the humanity from a person that might look a little different or have a different political viewpoint? What is it that we actually all have access to? Who in this country is manufacturing dignity? Who in this country is producing empathy? How does that happen? And how can it happen unless we see each other in broader colors than just the kind of black and white, right or wrong that we've been spoon-fed forever?
That's deep.
I want to jump in because the improved civility is not my job. So I would probably say as an educator, because I think a lot of folks think I'm a historian, I'm an educator and an African American studies product, right? So those are my fields. And I think it's really important to think about teaching history differently. So one of the things I wanted to read, so that's why I got my little notebook, is a part of a poem from Erica Huggins, who was a member of the Black Panther Party. And so while she was incarcerated, she wrote a poem and she said, "I love people, love nature, love love. I am a revolutionary, nothing special, one soul, one life, willing to give, ready to die." And I think it's really important because we teach history. Anybody out here who are educators, you don't teach because you want people to be polite.
Right.
You don't teach because you're hoping that people will have better manners and be courteous. You're teaching because you love, right? You teach because, and you teach that, and you're hoping that I interact with you out of love. Politeness is usually out of fear, right? People are real polite to you because they don't want you to like backhand slap them into the wall, or you don't want violence. It's not because I actually respect you or I see you as a human being. And so to teach history is to get us around this idea that most of our freedom fighters, most of our liberators were operating out of a place of love. And for so long, people have been taught, we've been taught that it's all about hate and murder, right? The way that the Black Panthers have been painted, the way that Malcolm X and Assata and more have been painted is because we've all been taught who they are out of fear. And so if we really want to improve anything, it's to improve our relationship to one another and really function out of love, right? And I don't think we're there yet. You know, with all the legislation that's going on, I was like, you can't possibly sit here and tell me anything about you love anyone. Like, don't even, you can't. You just can't do it. And also this idea, one other thing I wanted to bring up, which Bamuthi brought up earlier, was about literacy. So I'm also a critical literacies person. And so critical in itself, in its definition, is about thinking about crisis, and that we're also on the point of disaster. And so also if we can start teaching in a way that this is urgent, right? That what we're doing is really about triage, and we're trying to save lives. So we can sit here and we can pretend and we can wait for hugs and handshakes and a lot of things, but people are literally dying because we fail to tell the truth. So just teaching from a place and teaching that most of our motivations and most of the people who fought for freedom is coming from a place of love.
That's real. Can I add too, man, when you talk about coming from a place of love, like I just want people to just deal with the humanity inside them. What would you do if your wife and child was in trouble? For anybody who called Denmark Vesey a terrorist, what would you do if your wife and child was in trouble? You would do any and everything to save them. You would do any and everything to free them. So that's how you have to look at Brother Denmark. White people have made movies about this stuff. What, the Traffic? Or Die Hard? These seriously. And they're looked at as heroes when they go to save their family. So how is this man looked at as a terrorist for going to save his family?
I love where we've gone with this theme of love, because I think that also needs to impact the strategies that we have in addressing these issues, right? So if someone's coming out of you of fear or anger and you're thinking about how to beat and navigate, but if someone's coming to you and you know that they are motivated by love, right? By something that they love, you know that walls, that's not going to do it, right? Unjust laws, that's not going to do it. If someone is coming at you and you know that they are fighting for what they love, history always tells the victory goes to those who care the most, not those who are the best armed and best prepared, the ones who have nothing more important to lose than that which they are fighting for. And so I think that understanding when people are coming at you or at us or at this or that with love, it changes up your strategy. It changes up your strategy. I was in a conversation the other day. It was wonderful, and folks were noting that they had been watching some of the things that I was working on and doing, and they called me brave. And I took that as a real compliment, but instinctively I said, no, I'm not brave. My mama loves me, right? And so it's not that I'm brave, it's that I'm well loved. And there is so much power and protection that comes from that. And then also when you're trying to return it, it really adjusts the strategy and I think the conversation that's coming. And so when folks are wondering, why haven't those people just sat down yet? Because we in love with what it is that we're trying to do. So I love, so thank you, Dr. Butler, for bringing that element into this conversation.
And I just want to build on the point you made. I'm privileged enough to live in the People's Republic of Oakland, California.
Hey.
That's right. Where the Black Panthers emanated from, and I have had conversations with Erica Huggins. And I think the key point about the Black Panther story that is told over and over again in Oakland, but not over and over again around the country, the same way Denmark Vesey's story might be told here, but it's not told around the country, is that the reason why the power came down on them isn't because of the gun stuff or because they were following cops. It was because they were feeding black kids breakfast.
Real talk.
And that sort of builds on that love piece. It was because they loved their community so much that they fed the children, and the powers that be said, we can't have that. And yet, governments all around this country then started feeding kids breakfast based on their program.
You know, and it's important, this is the second time. Yesterday, it started, I heard for the first time, it being described, the Denmark Vesey as a love story. And here we are, gathered here on the stage, and who would have, you know, truth be told, who would have thought that that's what we'd be talking about, a love story.
Are there T-shirts? There should be T-shirts.
There should be T-shirts.
As a person who communicates through T-shirts, I need a T-shirt.
Can I just briefly affirm this group as well, and just make a note that it didn't take us but 20 minutes to get to love. And that's who we are. And I don't mean we as representative of folks who have always reverted back to joy and love. That is just who we are as a people. And when you talk about like narratives and switching narratives or oscillating narratives, I think that within the public imagination there is a difficulty to grasp that aspect of our resilience. That the element of love and joy, even as we're being yelled at, even as these atrocious and horrific things have happened to us in our history, through the Middle Passage, through 400 or 500 years of colonization and imperialism, even through it all, our resilience is built upon love, and it's not manufactured, just very organically. It didn't take but 20 minutes for us to get there.
On yesterday, July the 13th, a historical marker was erected at a site of what was infamously known as the workhouse, a place where slaveholders could take their slaves and pay a fee to have them beaten, to get their minds right. The very same place where Denmark Vesey was most likely held before he was taken to the gallows for execution. A place that sat in the shadows of the city jail, where African-American soldiers from the 54th were captured after the assault on Fort Wagner and were held in that place, and a place that is directly across the street from Mills Manor Public Housing. What has been and continues to be the long-term effects of these knowingly or unknowingly strategic decisions on people of color? How are historic issues of the past affecting our current lives and discourse?
Woo. Some things make it hard to love. Yeah. And I think, but it's a really important example, right? And so, the part that I'm, of course, zoned in on is there was this place where you could take your slave, and while you went out to tea or whatever it is you're doing, you could have your slave beat. You don't have to watch it. You don't have to participate in it. You don't have to know it. You don't have to see it. And I think that the power of 2020 was that we were all trapped in our homes. And we didn't have the places that we usually have to run away and not see. Right? As much, even those who are most hateful, most tied to the status quo, it is really, really hard to hold on to your hate and your fear when you're watching someone else in immense pain and fear. It's really hard, and we were trapped, right? And we had to watch it. And I think that is one of the things that modern times makes it a little too easy to do. It is too easy to throw whatever we don't want to see into the workhouse. We can just put it over in the workhouse, have it handled. We're going to let them have that conversation. We're going to let them do that. Or I am going to have this policy, or this opinion, and I'm not going to look to my left to see how that policy is affecting my neighbor, right? Because then we could put it forward. And I think it's why we change historical narratives, right? We must change the historical narratives in order to deny our own humanity, right? You gotta change the story. A man fighting for the freedom of his child, yeah, well, we're all gonna watch that movie, right? But a terrorist threatening to kill everyone in the space, that's different. That is something we can get behind in a different way. And as we think about this time period, if you go back and you read some of the records, the fact that people were surprised, I mean really surprised, I mean bona fide, I'm like heartbroken that your slave would turn on you in such a way. You meant you were going to kill me? After I've heartbroken, I mean, and this is authentic. Yeah. This is really, really authentic. But in order to do that, they had to not see. And if we do anything with this moment, this conversation, this bicentenary here, I would challenge us to see just a little something more of something right now we are giving ourselves the false privilege of not seeing, whatever that is.
Deep, yep.
I mean, it makes me think about the call for abolition today, right? So the workhouse is no different than the prison industrial complex. I know a lot of people didn't want to say it, but it really is no different. Because it's the people that we believe need certain kinds of punishment, isolation, mistreatment, people that, because criminality is fluid. We know that because now people can buy weed wherever they, in all kinds of cities. But those same folks, you know, people who are doing it on the streets are now locked up, right, for all kinds of reasons. And so I think it's really important for us to think about this concept of how does it impact us now, is when people are saying we need to abolish prisons, folks get real sideways and twitchy about it. But at the end of the day, like, the people felt the same way about slavery. But it happened. And so for us, it's asking the question of, like, can you imagine a world? Can you dream up a world where people who have committed crimes, and how we can rethink crimes, because right now abortion is about to be considered a crime, and I can't imagine putting pregnant folks behind bars. Asada was one of those folks who was pregnant, but we're not going to have that conversation today. But I think it's really important for you to think about that continuation. The workhouse has never left America. It has continued forward. And so I just want you to think about abolition and its possibilities. And if you're like, I'm still on the fence, well, the illustrious Ruthie Wilson Gilmore just published a collection of her works called Abolition Geography. Get into it. She's a black woman geographer who decided to start a PhD at 40, and she's been writing for the past 30 years about abolition. And so it's possible if we're willing to dream it. And so just thinking about every time we think about these systems, just understand the workhouse has never left us.
I also think, too, one of the main reasons these things are still impacting us is because there's been no atonement, you know? And it's like, yo, you really can't heal what you don't reveal. So it makes no sense to keep trying to conceal history. Like, we gotta, you know, as it says, truth be told, truth must be told. We got to tell the truth, and, you know, we gotta fix those wounds that are still here.
That's important, because I was going to follow in Dr. Powers. I know you're going to jump into how do we go forward from here, and I'm hearing a lot of how we could do that. Dr. Powers?
Yeah, so, you know, I think about this over the last 50 years, and we're continuing a process that really ramped up in the 1960s and 70s, and that really is excavating this experience that we're talking about, the African American experience. You know, I can recall looking at a book entitled Charleston in 1880, which was a city with a black majority in 1880. But there are no images in the book of black people, 1880. But really, since the 1960s, we've really been working to excavate this experience. With regard to the workhouse, most folk don't realize, and people who know about Denmark Vesey don't know that there was an uprising, a slave uprising in 1849 at the workhouse. And I think 30-odd people broke out of the workhouse, and some of them got as far away as North Carolina, you know. So this was another actual uprising, a slave uprising that occurred in Charleston in 1849, but most folk know nothing about it. But we're excavating that story, as well as continuing to expand the story of Denmark Vesey. And Dr. Matthews, and I'm not sure whether you know this or not, but we're telling that story at the museum.
Are we now?
We're telling that story at the museum. And that's the point. You know, and people have this, and this goes back to what Dr. Butler was saying earlier about the way the history is taught, and is taught, you know, where the students have to memorize all these dates and names and so, and what in history is all about the past, right? But it's not really about the past. And that's what James Baldwin says. He says the power of history is not so much that it explains the past, but that it is inside of us. It's inside of us. Whatever version we have, it is inside of us, and it controls us in a variety of different ways, and it shapes us, regardless of what narrative you have. And when it shapes us, it determines our goals, our aspirations, our fears, what you dread, all of those things. And so we really have to think about history in the way that Faulkner thought about history. The past is not dead, it's not over. Claudia Rankin, history is buried in the cupboards of our flesh. That's where it is. That's where it is. And once you get people to understand that this thing we call history is really capable of motivating us, it's capable of stunting us also. It's capable of doing that too. And so we have to be very careful about the way we deal with this subject. And one of the most important things that's part of this ongoing process is excavating this black experience. And it's not just Booker T. Washington, Martin Luther King Jr., and so on and so forth. Nothing wrong with them. But we want to tell the story in such a way that people understand that this America that we're in now was created as a result of initiatives, in a lot of ways, that African Americans took and African people took, some in the Caribbean, some on the African continent, some in Europe, because black folks are in all of those places, you know? I mean, we can't understand Go West, Young Man, territorial expansion, and the whole theme of the key of the West to American prosperity until we understand Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian Revolution. And that's how we got that property. That's how we got it, because of the work that black people did. And so this broader view of what history is and what it's capable of doing is so terribly important and pertinent.
Well, it has been 200 years since the planned uprising of 1822 and the subsequent hanging of 35 black men, 22 in one day. The recent racially motivated shootings and the resurgence of crimes all cloaked in hatred are still present today. how much do you believe has been done in reckoning with the growing danger of hate groups within the country and the recognition of the role slavery played in building our country?
You want to go? All right. So Dr. Powers brought up James Baldwin, and so I thought about this letter that he writes to Angela Davis in 1970. I didn't just think about it, I had to write it down. So there's a section of it where he says...
That's for me. Just tell him I'll call him back.
Right. We'll be with you shortly. No, you're fine. So he says, quote, "As long as white Americans take refuge in their whiteness, they're unable to walk out of this most monstrous of traps. They will allow millions of people to be slaughtered in their name." And so, end quote. And so I want to replace that. I want to pull out white Americans, and I want to put in white supremacists, right? And then I want to think about cloaked in their whiteness and also white supremacy, because white supremacy doesn't just live inside of white people, right? There's a white supremacists live inside of people who see LGBTQ community members as a threat, who see brown and black people walking across the border as illegals and people who should be trampled down with horses, right? Like you don't have to have white skin to be a white supremacist. And so I think that's really important, because so much of the violence we are seeing is exactly that, people being slaughtered in the name of white supremacy. And that's 1970. He's looking at Vietnam, and he's talking about a lot of different things. But I think it's really important that we have to understand that white supremacy is morphing, right? It's morphing in these ways where you see people who look like you saying things that are destructive. And they're talking about communism in China, and I'm like, what are we doing? How did we get here? So as a result, this is how you get the kind of violence and ongoing, and I think that if we're gonna do any kind of reckoning, we have to really think about the trauma that continues to be passed through and passed down through communities, but also recognizing that white supremacy, the face of white supremacy, is morphing so quickly that it's really going to destroy us if we do not call it what it is, right? And it shows up in the legislation. It shows up when it tries to rip out things out of the classroom that actually make our classes stronger, right? When it gets into the roots of the curriculum, all of that matters, because when you aren't teaching young people to see the world critically, they get sucked into these other things. Hence the reason why this young man who was just bored and spent all that time ends up in Buffalo, right? Because he's bored. Baby, pick up a book. Octavia Butler got a whole lot that she's been teaching us all this time. So I think it's just really important that if we're going to talk about the history of slavery, and we're going to talk about its reckonings, and have we done that? No, we haven't, because we hate to we call it what it is. White supremacy is white supremacy. Hate is hate. And so as a result, when we think about legislation, people are on the fence. Is it a hate crime? I'm not sure. Yeah, you know exactly what it is. Call it what it is, try the person, and do what needs to be done, but we're not gonna do that. But yet we're up here asking about civility? Like, nah, I can't be polite in a world where I'm trying to go to the grocery store and somebody's gonna shoot me, or I send my children to school and they're gonna get gunned down in a classroom and the police officers stand outside with shields. So until we get real serious about education at all levels, ain't no way white supremacy is gonna just up and disappear in the middle of the night. That's my 2 cents.
If it's okay with you, I'd like to subvert the question just a little bit, because deservedly and consistently marking the 200th anniversary, we're talking a lot about history, we're talking a lot about the past, but I'd really like to talk about futurity. And this is really inspired by you conjuring Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler, brilliant novelist, Afrofuturist, first novel is called Kindred. And it's a novel written in the late 1970s. Very quickly, it centers around a woman who has an ancestor that summons her from the 20th century to the 18th century at the drop of a dime. It's science fiction. So she's just chilling. She's like sitting in her crib in California, and she feels a shake, and all of a sudden she's in 1836 and doesn't know how she got there. She keeps getting pulled back. She gets pulled back once, she gets pulled back twice. By the third time, she's like, all right, look, if this is gonna keep happening to me, I'm gonna pack a bag. And I'm gonna pack a bag full of the stuff that I need. I'm gonna pack some Tylenol, I'm gonna pack some jeans. One of the things that when I teach Kindred, I often ask students to pack a bag for the future. In the same way that this fictional character is rushed back and prepares for a life in the past, what would you pack right now if at any moment you could be whisked 150 years into the future? What are the heirlooms, what are the artifacts, what are the tools for the future that we anticipate? And a lot of the future that we anticipate right now is built upon the grounds of our trauma, of our pathologies. I got 99 problems, and white supremacist, heteronormative patriarchy is most of them. How do we take all of the efforts that have systemically been built? How do we take the architecture of oppression and think about a different paradigm? Because we're going to have to do this very intelligently, and it's going to require multiple paths of action. There's a pedagogy or a framework of learning that's going to have to be focused on literacy, on history. There is also a pedagogy of democracy that we have to reconstitute for ourselves based on the future that we want. And then finally, if I can just evoke Kennedy again, there has to be a pedagogy of greatness, because the 35th president talked about the moon. He asked us to create a mathematics that wasn't there yet. And in fact, black women created that mathematics eventually. No surprise. But the project of a satellite, the project of the unreachable, is spiritual and secular at the same time. The ambition to literally reach a different frontier. Those are the earth problems that we should try to be solving. But we're not solving those earth problems. We're not solving the problems of the impossible. We're solving problems of the marketplace. And I'd like to think we're a little bit better than that. So how do we work on those three tracks at the same time? The project of literacy, the project of democracy, and the project of the impossible in the name of the future that we deserve.
All right.
I wonder, can we get to the future in a system that seems like it's constantly trying to bring us back?
That's what artists are for.
Well, truth be told, oh shoot, I just did it. Okay.
You did it again!
Truth be told, we got to this one, right? So 200 years ago, this right here, oh, this is a no-no, right? Okay,
Right.
okay.
Right.
You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7 refined Negroes on stage talking foolishness with microphones, and we're not just talking to ourselves, right? I see people in the audience that don't look like me. And I don't just mean in skin color, right? I'm seeing all of this. And so I think part of me, the one thing history gives me is no excuse for shortchanging my future. And as hard as that is to deal with sometimes, it is the truth. To your question, I remember I was listening to Stacey Abrams, whoop, whoop, sometime after, she had lost her first bid for governor.
Before she wins the next one is what you're saying.
Right.
Yes.
Just, this
All right.
meantime space, this meantime space. And, there were issues then about, authentically, stolen elections in that space. And it was interesting. She got a question, saying, what were we going to do and how does she still feel about all of these ballots that were hidden and miscounted? And she said, while she considered that a valid question, what she was more focused on is that if everyone who could have voted actually had voted, that vote would have overwhelmed everything that had been done in that space. And I think that one of the most insidious and effective tools at the disposal of those that would pull things back is the terrorizing of hope, right? And belief, right? And not understanding, we actually have the numbers. If you just get on up there and do what we need to do. And that is so very true for many things. And so even as I'm watching the trauma and the tragedy of recent violence, I am less interested in those who are perpetrating the violence than I am in those who benefit from the violence that's being perpetrated, right? Because I think that is part of where we need to look. For folks whose fear and anger and uncertainty is being taken advantage of. It's being taken advantage by something, someone, right? It does benefit someone. It does benefit something. And I think that this is kind of where my focus is. But to answer also Bamuthi's question directly, how do we do all of these simultaneously? It's, we all take up our own mantle. Our own battle. What I find is different folks are passionate about different things. I'm going to sign your petition, but I got to go to this march, right? In terms of those kinds of things. And I think that if we lean into where we would all lean into, it does all have to be done simultaneously. It cannot be sort of one after another. But I hear all of this noise, right? I hear all of this good, healthy anger and dissatisfaction with what is going on right now. That is much louder to me than all of the other things that I'm hearing. And it's not just because of the circles that I run in. And I'm wondering, how do I convince the all too silent majority that it is time to act like who we are, which is to say the majority, because that is still what our system leans into and will respond to.
Now, many of you bring contemporary ethos to this discussion. How can the arts and culture, including comedy, be used when addressing challenging figures in our history?
You said comedy, so is that where I come in? Is this for me? I hadn't talked in a while, so you want to get me?
Okay.
I mean, first of all, I think we should never, well, let me just say this full stop. If you're getting your news and information primarily from comedians, you're doing it wrong. The comedian's joke can lead you to do more research, but don't quote the comedian's joke as if it is the research, because I can guarantee you that 99% of the comedians did no research. So let's just start there. Trans people matter. So I think it is important for where I stand and the specific route I've chosen and the specific where I find myself, to constantly remind myself that I have to be a person who corrects the narrative and then cites my sources. So for example, when we just did an episode, our last episode of United Shades of America on Sunday was about woke culture and has America gotten too woke, and I'm getting nauseous thinking about it, and has critical race theory. And so I went through the streets of, is that Amber Alert, was it?
Somebody bought a house phone in here, man. That's a whole house phone.
Truth be told.
Truth be told.
Cordless.
So, as a comedian and a college dropout, I'm not bragging, I was in Arizona talking to people on the streets about, they were like some white folks who were anti-critical race theory, and I said, okay, well, tell me what it is. Abba, abba, abba. great. And then in the show, we booked Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who is one of the founding scholars of critical race theory. So I know, therefore, as a person who has a show on CNN, I know a lot of CNN viewers don't look like me, don't think like me, don't talk like me. I'm going to go, I know you're more like the people out there who hate critical race theory but don't know what it is. It becomes my job in this position of power, in this position of privilege, to correct you directly to the source of where critical race theory is. So for me, I find that it is super important for me to recognize, one, the historical moment that we're in. America is, if you want to see where America could go, read the news about Sri Lanka. And we are in a very key point, and those of us who are in positions of power, like myself.
You should have been in Clarence Thomas' pool, by the way. Speaking of Sri Lanka. You should have been swimming in his pool.
Is that it's important for me in the position I am to not take my eye off the ball and not take my eye off the historical moment, and to really make sure that I'm a connector to the primary sources, and it is bigger than just getting the jokes off.
I agree 100%. I'm not a comedian. I'm just a man from Moncks Corner, South Carolina, who, the Bible says God looks out for babies and fools. He looked out for this fool. And I just utilize my platforms to put people on those platforms that are way smarter than me, that know what they're talking about, when it comes to these issues. And I think that's what I'm here to do, because, Malcolm X said that a man who, controls the media controls the minds of the masses. So that's my role.
I love art as a tool in this space. I think that the power of art is not that people don't necessarily take art seriously. It's that when engaged with art, we don't take ourselves as seriously, right? And it opens up the space. And so, a shout out to both Kamau and Charlemagne, Private School Negro, Breakfast Club. As I watch the two of you sort of in those spaces with something that seems so, just pure entertainment. I tell you something, very, very few African-American artists just do pure entertainment. And there's a special kind of genius, I think, behind that. The research that particular comedians use to get the laugh. We're laughing at a reality that we're not yet ready to talk about. And it's very funny, because we all know that we know and you just told us we know, but we're not talking about it. Okay, we're going to laugh right here. Okay, and so there is something in that, and I had the honor of being able to announce the opening of the museum on the Breakfast Club. Lord, that's a machine. Those brothers and sisters were prepared. They had read stuff, and they were having these questions, and they were putting me in this seat because they understood how their audience listens and hears, and they were taking everything that I was trying to do and serving it up in a way that it could be heard by those who were listening to that particular tone of voice. And that, I think, is the power of art, and how it has always been one of the most effective tools. And I think that right now, what we could all use in our lives is a little more art. And be that the art of comedy or the art of performance, or in the case of the museum, the art of storytelling, right? We use it a lot with our younger children, which is if you want them to memorize and know something, if you put it in story form, they can give it back to you a whole lot easier. And so I think that this is really powerful and really important, and it's one of the reasons why I really appreciate the way we've set up the bicentenary, which has elevated art to the true power of itself in this space for these conversations.
Well said. And I'm not sure in this moment, because they say art reflects life. I'm not sure in this moment if the art is really reflecting what's going on in this country. I don't hear the sense of urgency from artists, about the things that are going on in this country like I should. That's my personal opinion.
I mean, I think, are you talking about a certain level of artists? Because I feel like there are artists who are doing it who may not have the mainstream platform.
True. I feel like at a time like this, you need more Public Enemies, right? Like you need.
I mean, Public Enemies literally still out there.
You need more Killer Mikes. I'm looking for the younger versions of that.
I agree. I think I've been a bit surprised at kind of the lack of those songs that sort of came out just very recently. I heard one or two really good ones, but part of what I also want my generation to have is we still know all the songs from the 60s, right? Because they were good songs. And I agree we should still sing them at the protest, but can we get a new song? And so I think I really agree with you, but part of me also wonders, have we lost control, I'm about to go somewhere, of the narrative of hip hop, such that folks do not understand that the origins of that genre were actually about telling the truth of the black experience inside of that art form?
See, that's messed up, man, because, there's 11 minutes left. And now you want to start talking about hip hop. I have a 20-year-old son. I have a 17-year-old daughter. And my son voted for the first time 2 years ago. Word to the vote. He probably is much less aware of who his congressperson is than who Tyler, the Creator, is. Music and musicians are avatars for us all. And getting back to that joy space, getting back to that space of hip hop, I don't know who I would be if it wasn't for Tribe Called Quest. Not just the music, but the embodiment and also the community that the music created. When I went to see De La Soul, Leaders of the New School, Tribe Called Quest, together, Chi Ali, when I saw the Native Tongue together at Irving Plaza in Manhattan when I was 15, 16 years old, who was I with? My community, a whole bunch of other mostly black misfits. Art is the space that stewards the public imagination and also cultivates community within the public imagination. And so one of the things that I might want to do with this question is to, again, just think about it a little bit differently. I don't think the question so much is like, how does art, or how can art get us to a more equitable future? The artists are actually fine. It's the bankers. It's y'all. Like, we're okay. We inspire. We provide hope and entertainment and joy. We make the space for community. When was the last time an economist made the space for community? So maybe the question is, why isn't our healthcare system more art-like? Why isn't our legal system, why doesn't our legal system mirror the way that you make a play? These are the questions. What are we missing in terms of the normalization of artists as leader that has led to such dis-ease within the public space and the public landscape? Artists are the example, not all of them, not all of us. But when I think about the aspect of aspiration, when I think about the aspects of collaboration, when I think about centering joy, when I think about centering beauty, all those things are in art space, not in what we call the socio-political, conflux that we're all trapped in. So, support an artist today. Thank you for coming to an art center to hear this conversation, because y'all need to be more like us.
And to answer that question, I think, because art is rooted in love, and the healthcare system and the legal system is rooted in white supremacy, like everything else in America.
Let's broaden this a little bit, and not beyond what you said, but I'm just thinking about this in a different way. There's a reason that, for example, in Phyllis Wheatley's poems, dated back to the 18th century, late 18th century, her image was included with her poetry. Frederick Douglass's image, sketches, photographs in his autobiographies, because this was a way of demonstrating and proving that this work, this literary work, was the achievement of a black person. You know, Benjamin Banneker's letters to Thomas Jefferson, you know, in which there's, and in his almanacs, sketches of Benjamin Banneker, who says in one of his letters to Jefferson, "I am an African of the deepest dye." In other words, Yaphet Kotto. Yaphet Kotto. Now, Benjamin Banneker wasn't that dark. I mean, not real. But the point that he was making through art, the sketch, was this almanac that I have produced, which is the product of black ingenuity, a man who has mastered astronomy and mathematics. This is the work of a man who's purely African. And this work cannot be attributed to white blood coursing through my veins. And so this is a way that people have used art, not in museums, not on stages, but in, nevertheless, equally important arenas to make comments and statements about black competence and ability and beauty. This is why when Du Bois edits the NAACP publication, The Crisis, he has in many of those covers sketches and images of black women who are beautiful women to counteract the negative representations of black women that were so widely diffused in American society as a counterpoise and a counterweight. And so that really is the power of art in what we would call today non-traditional spaces, because we think about art in a museum and so, but we need art in other places for its value, and that's how someone like Du Bois and Phyllis Wheatley and Benjamin Banneker saw the value of art.
I just wanted to add in, because you brought up Thomas Jefferson. If you've never taken a moment to dig through his notes on the state of Virginia, he actually writes that there is no poetry to be found in the Negro, that is only misery, and you need love, and all these different experiences in order to write poetry. And so I think it's really important also to think about, in this particular moment, arts are wide. Right, so of all the arts that I could have been when I was at School of the Arts, I was a creative writer. And one of the people that I came across that I love is Tony K. Bambara, who says, the job of the writer is to make the revolution irresistible, right? And so if you do nothing else, I think that's also an art form that we overlook. We're demanding so much of musical artists, we're demanding so much of performers, we're demanding so much, but we never really sit down and think about the writers, right? The poets. Those are the people, I'm pretty sure at some point everybody's memorized the Maya Angelou poem and said it. And just thinking about, there's so many poets out there who are actually, when we're like, I don't see anybody doing X, Y, and Z, your poets ain't never stopped telling the truth, have never stopped documenting the moment. The writers are always really have their pulse on the finger, their finger on the pulse of the moment. And so I just think that's also important, that if we're thinking arts, that we have to think about all of them, performance, visual, but never forget, as we started with this conversation about letters, that there's something really dynamic about being able to reclaim poetry as part of who we are, when one of this country's alleged founding fathers said that there's no poetry to be found inside of us. So I just think that that's something that I hope that when you leave here today, that there's so many poets of color, black poets, local poets, that I will also hope you will support them as well, because they have never stopped documenting the moment.
Well, I know we're going to run out of a little time here, so I won't even mention my Gap band in Black Wall Street. So I think we had an opportunity. We wanted the audience to turn in your questions, because we actually want to hear from you as well. And so we're going to take a moment now to answer a few of your questions.
All right, so I want to fully acknowledge that folks were able to send questions, before the panel, and some folks put in during the panel. We got folks in the back typing things up as quickly as possible. We are not going to get to every question. So, pre-apologies for that. And plus, this group is a little chatty, so we might just, go left on one of these questions. For example, the question that's in front of me right now is about dismantling systematic racism. Okay, so the question that's coming before us is asking us to get out of this space and into other space. What policies or solutions have worked, or maybe almost worked, almost tweaked or pushed us a little bit in addressing systematic racism? Like in your space, in your work, what have you seen? Policies or solutions that have been put in that have slightly addressed systematic racism, and then you can pivot to thinking about how can we begin to dismantle racism in the United States. A lot of questions. Okay. So I'm going to kick us off, I think, on that one. I'm a big fan of levers, like little teeny levers. It's probably the engineer in me. And I was working on a program to encourage and to increase success of underrepresented students of color in, say, the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and math. And one of the things that I realized is that for our programs that were specifically designed to support particular audiences, we would have them take a math assessment and placement test. It was not a good, bad, ugly. It was like, we have 6 different math classes. Which one should you be in? We're going to give you this nice assessment, and we're going to figure out which class you should be in, because math is a gatekeeper course, and they go in order. So if you get put into the wrong math course, it doesn't just set you back a semester. It can set you back a year based on when that next course is being put in. So they knew for students that they were particularly working with, figuring out what math class they went in was great. And we could see the success results. So I had this little idea for this little teeny level. Well, how much does this math class cost? It was like $12 per student. $12 per student. Wouldn't the faculty appreciate it more if the students in their class actually belonged in their class? So what if we just gave everybody the math test? It's only $12 a student. Let's give every student that comes into the university the math test. And the reason was because there were capacity limits for these special programs that could wrap a big hug around students. And so the little lever was, if we actually made this assessment available to every student coming in, then every student could potentially end up in the right class and at least eliminate the barrier of being in the wrong class for an entire year and putting it was a little lever. I didn't say I am dismantling the structure of racism that's embedded in this predominantly white institution. I said the test is only $12 per student, and wouldn't our faculty really appreciate it if students were prepared for these courses in the way that we need them to be? So that's one of my strategies, is around little levers, little unsuspecting levers that I've seen, and that's in a very academic example. So other examples of folks that have seen it in their spaces, policies or solutions that have addressed something that you would have considered systematic impact.
I think some of us look through the rest of the world. I think about places like Germany, where after World War II, even the symbols of Nazism were illegal. You couldn't build a statue to a great Nazi general. You couldn't name a high school after a great Nazi. You couldn't be I just like to collect Nazi memorabilia. You couldn't be a collector of it. You couldn't have a reenactment of Nazi moments that went well. It was illegal, full stop. And so for me, that shows that the government, that point, and I know Nazism is rising around the world right now, yay. But it showed that at that point, the government of Germany was like, we have to, at the very least, show that we are not with this at all, which our country, as we all know, has never really grasped, even indicting the bad people in our history.
That's right. That's
The
right.
name of the street that we on.
I did a whole episode of my TV show about that because I think denazification is something that could work in America. I would call it decrackification, but I don't know if we can truly dismantle racism in America, but I wish we could find a way to punish it at least, because other than that, the only solution I got is, man, Thanos got to come with the Infinity Gauntlet and all 6 Infinity Stones, and we just got to snap some people out of existence. Like,
I think part is just the recognition also, too. We spent so many times not even recognizing. We're still having discussions about whether there is systemic racism. And so you got to have that big part of recognizing what it is. Other countries have been successful, at least going back to the starting point, and then being able to move forward. That's a part of it. And continue to tell the truth, the whole truth. We got more in common than our differences.
Thank you. So the next question we have, I'm going to broaden it a bit. It's about naming, right? It's about naming. And there are two sort of mirror mini galleries that we are building inside the International African American Museum. One is called the Port of Departure and one is called the Port of Arrival. And we have the names. We have the names, not just numbers, the names of individuals. Because certain ships were confiscated for illegal slave trading. There were court cases and court documents. So on the port of departure, we have the opportunity to put in the African names, right? The African names. And then on the port of arrival, the names are not so African. So on the port of arrival, these are more of the given names or the regulated names that individuals were given. And so this question is, why is he referred to as Denmark Vesey instead of, and I'm about to work on this pronunciation, Telemake? Seems that we should not call him by the name his slave masters gave him. And so I want to give the panel an opportunity to sort of share thoughts on that, or more broadly around the conversation of Black folks naming, right? We often change our names when we come into different phases of our life and kind of where we are. So let's talk really quickly about this question about referring to Denmark Vesey in the way that we do, and also this bigger conversation about Black folks being named versus us naming ourselves.
Well, when Telemark or Denmark became free, he took the name Vesey. So he took that surname. But we're not absolutely even sure where Vesey was from. So, the argument is made, well, he's from the Virgin Islands, St. Thomas. Some arguments have been made that he's from the Gold Coast in West Africa. So we're not even absolutely certain of where he was from. So given that uncertainty, we're probably not absolutely sure that Telemark was his original name either. So, but he took the surname Vesey, which is what many African Americans who had been enslaved did after the Civil War anyway. So that's just some information on that.
Yeah, and I would say the same in looking at it too, when I looked at it as a question, and I guess because just doing the research so much, I would see both the names there all the time. So it kind of interesting is there. And I was troubled with that too, Dr. Powers, but it's not the uncertainty of whether that's what it should be, but I certainly always encourage people to put both names there as well.
I mean, to me, it feels like, yes, we can do a better job of connecting both these names together. But I think as someone who goes on TV and talks about issues of racism a lot, I will then be on Twitter, how come you said Black instead of African American? How come you said people of color? Black people aren't people of color. And, these are all real issues, but are just all ways to address we don't know what our names are. We didn't take on this label. These labels were tossed on us, and we're trying to sort it out in real time. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we have to have a little bit of just a little bit of graciousness around the fact that we are still in the middle of figuring this out.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, I like that point a lot because I think, black folks have had very divergent reactions into our lack of naming. Some have gone all the way to, well, I'm just gonna name myself what I want to name myself. And some choose a soft name, some choose a really aggressive one. So we have this cycle of choosing names, and then others go to the fact of the other side, which is you can call me whatever you want. I am still going to be who I am because I know you have the power to change my name, so I don't put my identity into that. And so I think one of the things is acknowledging the full spectrum. If you want to know what somebody's name is, you're going to have to ask them. And so our next question, we've answered a little bit, and so I'm going to tweak it as well. This question is, why isn't Denmark Vesey as well known as other important black figures? And I think we've talked about that a bit. And so, we're going to sort of lightly touch on this question as we go to the next question. But I also want to ask folks, are there any other sort of special favorite hidden stories in your repertoire? Do you know of a story or a figure that you learned of kind of late in life and you're thinking, I wish I had known that earlier, that you would add to the list of untold narratives? Now, you do not get to tell the whole narrative right now, okay? Because folks have to go. It's still a school night. But any thoughts about favored untold narratives?
Mine is going to be Alice Wine. So Alice Wine, most people know Esau Jenkins, Septima Clark, and Bernice Robinson. But Alice Wine gets really overlooked in that story. So they're the three kind of engineers, architects of the citizenship schools on the Sea Island, specifically Johns Island. And I think it's important because the person who gets left out is Alice Wine, because she's the one who, after memorizing a section of the Constitution and passing it in order to vote, she's the one who turns to Esau Jenkins and says, I actually want to learn how to read. And so it's that ask from a community member to Mr. Jenkins that sparks this school. And so for me, I just think it's important that we keep that kind of individual, this like on the ground, black woman, working class woman who makes a specific ask, as kind of the spark for these citizenship schools, which then blossom all across the South in order to teach African Americans how to read and write and pass literacy tests in the 50s and 40s.
Yep. Yeah. For me, I don't know if you would consider this person a hidden figure, but he's definitely a person that doesn't get mentioned like I think he should, and that's the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Because without the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, you don't get Malcolm X, you don't get Muhammad Ali, you don't get the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, you don't get, the Nation of Islam, you don't get great literature like, How to Eat to Live, Message to the Black Man. So for me, somebody like him, his story should be told a lot more.
Thank you for that.
I want to speak the name of Bayard Rustin.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I wish that I knew or had more examples growing up of leadership, of gay men, of queer women in positions of leadership. As a straight person, I wish that queer leaders were a better part of my lexicon growing up. But I want to speak the name specifically of Bayard Rustin because we talk about the person behind the person. We talk about the organizing muscle behind the face of liberation. And I think one of the things that we do is we tend to put leadership in general in a very narrow lane. And the leaders that are outside of that lane just don't get much love, which is why maybe we don't hear as often about black women in the lead. We don't hear as often about First Nations people in the lead. We don't hear as often about queer leaders in the lead. So Bayard Rustin is a story I wish I knew
growing up. I didn't know James Baldwin was gay until 10 years ago. You know what I mean? Or Alice Walker, or Octavia Butler. All these leaders whose sexuality has been decoupled from their identity. And I think that that's intentional as well.
Yeah, and man, the conversations between Bayard Rustin, James Baldwin, and Malcolm X, those are some of the greatest debates that you'll ever hear, you know? And it was just interesting to see those three individuals, you know, share space with each other, because at the end of the day, it didn't matter what their sexuality was. All they cared about was the liberation of black people. That's it.
I'd like to answer that question and let's go a little bit different direction. So I'm privileged enough to come here tonight, privileged enough to hang out with you all, got to see a tour of the museum, got to go to Mother Emanuel, got to connect with my Instagram friend, KJ Kearney, and I got to meet somebody who clearly is a hero here. I don't need to give his bio because clearly he's a hero here. I just met him tonight, was Dr. Thaddeus Bell. And KJ was talking to him and telling the story and about commercials and about the thing, and I was like, man, I need to be, if I can direct his documentary. So for me, that's the idea, like to come to a place like this and to meet people in the community who, we shouldn't let a story like that go away while he's still here. You should celebrate him while he's here, as clearly many of you do, and make sure the story continues.
Amen.
Thank you for that. All right, so our next question is actually a little bit of a technical question. I like it because it suggests that some of our audience members did some pre-reading. What kind of lottery was it that Vesey won in 1790? Was it anything like today's lotteries? And the part of this question that I'm really curious about is, was this something common that slaves could participate in and purchase their freedom?
I really want to know the answer to this, because when I checked into my hotel today, salute to this man named Chuck. He's an older white guy who works at the hotel, and he slipped the lottery ticket of Denmark Vesey under my door today. So I've never seen it before. He has a picture of the actual lottery ticket, and it had like $1,500, and the winning numbers I think were 1884, and then it was like 500, 250, 150. So I guess he picked the 1884 and won the $1,500. So I was sitting there thinking, like, what is this, Mega Millions? Is this Powerball? Like, what was this Quick Picks? Like, what was this? Like,
Dice, CeeLo.
Now, Charlie, you sit on my board. I'm gonna need that piece of paper. I'm gonna need that. I'm gonna need that.
I mean, we'll also take it if you don't want to give it. We'll take it over at Avery and add it to our Denmark Vesey collection too. So we can thug this out afterwards. One of the things I did want to add, because I know this is like Dr. Power's thing, is I want to give a quick shout out to Nick Butler. If you don't do anything else in your time cleaning your house, is listen to his podcast. And he does a complete, like a 30-minute podcast about lotteries and explaining how the city really developed these kind of lotteries to repair and do projects. And so I just wanted to give a shout out to Nick Butler with the Charleston County Public Library for keeping us educated through the podcast.
Well,
And I think,
I think we're going to say something
Well-
about that lot.
Well, I don't know a whole lot about lotteries, but there were a number of them in Charleston, and the one that Vesey won was called the East Bay Lottery, and he won the $1,500. Now, his owner could easily have just taken all the money. I mean, because Vesey, as an enslaved person, he was property, so property couldn't own property. So, but the owner allowed him to then keep some of the money, which he then in turn used to buy his freedom. But it was the East Bay Lottery, yeah. And there were a number of them in Charleston.
And a part of that common practice, that's what being a common practice, is certainly his wife and children were owned by someone else, James Evans, and he could not purchase the freedom of his wife and children, so they remained in bondage. So to answer a part of that question about common practice and being able to do that, no. And we never understood why Joseph Vesey even agreed to the deal at all.
I think some things like that are really important in terms of, it wasn't about the money. You know, a lot of this has never really been about the money. To Dr. Power's point, you could have wanted, we could just take all the money, or we could let you keep the money and not have your freedom, or let you keep some of the money, have your freedom, but not the freedom of those you care about. Some folks could participate, some folks couldn't, and so I do think that it's interesting, and for me it kind of doubles down on this, for lack of a better term, privilege that Denmark Vesey had, that he still decided to put on the table when he saw that that privilege was not given out in a way that moved him and his people forward. So this last question is going to be our last question. We're going to wrap it up, and we're going to also do a bit of a round robin, and I'm going to invite each of our panelists to include their last thoughts in the frame of this question. And this question is a nice solid question, I think, to end on. Are there any words of encouragement that you might have for modern day abolitionists and disruptors who seek social justice in every space they occupy, whatever space that is? Do you have any words of encouragement for these folks, and how can we, individuals here, support them in this work? So I am going to start, as I have been trained, with my elder statesman in the room. So Dr. Powers, I'm going to let you kick it off and tell us young guns how it's supposed to be done.
Yes, because I've been in the trenches so long.
Elder.
Yeah. Well, let me just say this. The project of America is a long one, and we speak about the need to do what? Perfect the nation, to perfect the nation. And everyone that comes along hopefully plays a role in that process. But it's a long one. I mean, just think about it. America has been a slaveholding and Jim Crow practicing nation longer than it's been a nation that practices racial egalitarianism to the extent to which it exists today. It's been for most of its history overtly slaveholding and racist for most of its history. Now we have to face up to that. But fortunately, we have moved beyond that, and hopefully we'll continue to move in the right direction. Although there are forces, and we've mentioned that today, that are every day trying to pull us back. The point that I'm making here is that you have to be in the struggle for the long haul. It's not one election, 2 election cycles. You know, look how long the civil rights movement went on. And actually historians that study the civil rights movement date its roots to the 1930s, not the 1950s, but to the 1930s. So folk like Mary McLeod Bethune, who has not just recently been added to the statues there, the House of Representatives, the Congress, were in the struggle for decades. Think of Du Bois, and you know, Du Bois lived almost a century, wrote 3 autobiographies, in the struggle for the long run. And we've got to be in the struggle for the long run. Look at what has just happened. Yes, Roe versus Wade, 50 years, and we thought safe. So we've got to be in the struggle for the long term, and we have to always remember that regardless of what gains have been made, they can be lost if we're not vigilant. They can be lost. They can be taken away from us. January 6th, they can be taken away from us. So those are the comments that I would make.
Thank you. I'm going to do a bounce, so I'm going to bounce over to Brother Bamuthi.
Great. I guess my words of encouragement, to repeat something, to echo something that Kamal said earlier, graciousness, and specifically the application of grace towards oneself. I think that as we are embattled, as we are antagonistic, as we are confrontational and at war, it's really important to consider tenderness on some Otis Redding. Like, be gentle with yourself and those who love you. I think that too often the posture of battle is so ferocious that we lose patience with ourselves. And in so doing, we lose a piece of our humanity. So there's a way, I think, to be fierce and to be fire, and also to practice a sense of more than self-care, self-actualization through self-love, that I think is really important, because, as Dr. Power said, this is a long con. It is absolutely a marathon, and it requires all of us. And that's not going to happen if you burn out after the first 50 meters. So the tenderness that it takes to endure as applied to the self.
Thank you for that. All right, Charlemagne.
Man, I first of all, I would tell, the modern day abolitionists and disruptors that I love them, I value them, and I appreciate them. And, I think the way that we support them, the way I support them, is by, lending my platform to them, as well as funding. These people, man, they put their lives on the line every day. They're the ones that are protesting at the Capitol when we're just sitting around on Twitter, talking about what's going on. Like Dr. Butler said about, literacy. I have a book in print, right? And that means a lot to me, because I am from South Carolina, where it was illegal for our ancestors to read. So the voices that I want to, put out there are people like Tamika Mallory, who is one of our modern day, disruptors, whether it's people like Tamika, whether it's people like, Kimberly Jones, whether it's people like Ben Crump, regardless of how you feel about these people are on the front lines fighting for us all the time. So for me, I support them by lending my platform and financially, because, you study history, you see that people like Harry Belafonte, like Aretha Franklin, they were behind a lot of these civil rights movements, with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Muhammad Ali with the Nation of Islam. So that's my role as an entertainer and a media personality, I believe, to provide a platform and support them financially. And I mean, anybody in here can support them financially, whether it's $1, $5. They all have different organizations you can donate to, and they need this money. They need it.
Thank you for that. Yes. Freedom is a lot of things. Free ain't one of them. Okay. Dr. Butler, over to you.
Y'all know I got notes. So one of the things that I wanted to think about is I want to bring Erica Huggins back into the room. And she says in a poem, maybe longing for freedom will soon make others homesick for our natural state, in with earth, air, fire, water, but living, not dead, not asking for freedom, but free. And so I think I like the word longing, because it also goes back to something that Bamuthi said about self-love. And I was thinking rest. I think too often in this world, it's really hard to rest. You know it. When you're sitting and you're laying in your bed and you're scrolling, and then you fall asleep and the phone slaps you in the face kind of thing. Like that kind of, you're constantly being engaged, right? You're constantly on, and it's like, how can you take a minute to rest? Because you can't, unless you hit a deep level of sleep, it's also really hard to dream, right? And so I think too often we can't when Charlemagne asked the question before about like, can we build a future in a time like this where we, you just can't see it, it's because we haven't made ourselves available to rest. And so I would say encouraging folks to disconnect for just some time, pick up a book is also really nice. Speaking of books, I'm going to plug myself. I have one called Where is Justice, which talks with things about educators and young people really thinking about justice. And so I would say that if you do nothing else, it's find time to rest, to build yourself a collective of people. The NAP ministry is my go-to, where she says, it is our duty to rest, right? That is our reparations. That is the thing that our ancestors could not do safely. And so I just think that's also important. And so knowing that if no place else, that we've created spaces across the city, but specifically for us at Avery, we try to be a hub for people to find rest and to rejuvenate and to be inspired. And so that's my hope, that you'll find rest.
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to be giving Lee the last word, so Kamal, go ahead.
I want to talk to the white people for a second. Because I think we have been great words for the abolitionists and the social justice disruptors, but I feel like the white people in here need to get to your Google Calendar and make sure that every day there is something in your Google Calendar that is telling you how to be an anti-racist. You have to, it's got to be just like you have your Peloton calendar, you need to be clear that this is an everyday thing. Some of you may have come here thinking that tonight is the thing. Tonight is the launch to the thing. I guarantee, and since we're here in Charleston, I would say start local. Support local organizations that are already working in anti-racism. You don't need to start your own. You can start with local organizations, black-led organizations, probably black women-led organizations. Sounds like some of those people are here right now. Are there people here who lead anti-racism organizations here in Charleston? Literally talk to those people after the show. Talk to those people should stand out front if you got time. Talk to those people, but have your Venmo ready to go, all right? So it's not just... You have to start taking assignments from the people in your community who are already doing the work so you can support them in doing the work.
Thank you for that. And I would say, my advice is just very, very simple in two parts. We've talked about this as the long haul, so we're clear that this is not a sprint. And I would say that this work is also not a marathon. It's actually a relay race. And I think the one thing that we as disruptors sometimes forget is that we are not alone, and that it may not be your job to cross the finish line. You just got to get the baton to the person who is waiting there. And there's something about not letting your teammate down. You were done. You were spent. If it was just about you, you'd have stopped 15 minutes ago. But your girl, she up there waiting for you, and you don't want her to come backwards. So you will hand off that baton. You know what you get to do after you hand off the baton? You get to rest, okay? You get to rest because it's a circular course. So it's gonna come back around, and it will be your turn to take up that baton again. But to think about this as a relay, that's my first bit of advice. And my second bit harkens back to something we talked about earlier today. This is one of my favorite quotes. It's been attributed to St. Augustine, and that quote is, "Just love and do whatever else you like." And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our original host, Mr. Lee Bennett.
Well said. I only say a short thing about the question we had, and clearly the theme throughout has been about support, but it's about standing in that gap too. We had a way of doing these things. People before us taught us how to do those things. In some way, we kind of lost that a little, and we didn't pick up on those things. We were trained. And it's just about the support and being there and doing the things that we know that can encourage and can keep these young people moving forward. I want to say that we recognize that the time tonight is not enough time to discuss all the things VC and related to those subjects. But it is my sincere hope that this is the beginning of many discussions about Denmark VC. I want to thank this panel here. Please, I think they deserve a round of applause. Yeah. Listen. And yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You know, Denmark Vesey did not want to destroy the United States. He wanted the institution of slavery destroyed. Vesey wanted the United States to live up to its own ideals of freedom. That's the point. What Vesey did was to fight for those ideals and for those people who were in bondage. He embraced the spirit of fugitivity. It is past time that we honor a man who gave so much. And on those thoughts, I want you to remember Denmark Vesey. Thank you and good night.